Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society and the chair of the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience. I'm thrilled to welcome you this afternoon to When Machines Speak, Language Processing in Computers and Humans, a virtual seminar organized by the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program as part of the Seminars in Society and Neuroscience. For those of you who haven't attended our previous seminars, I want very briefly to give you an overview of the Presidential Scholars Program and the Center for Science and Society. The Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior, bringing together talented early career scholars from various fields with faculty experts in neuroscience and in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The program has developed a new paradigm for original integrative research and training. The program supports early postdoctoral scholars, seed funding for cross-disciplinary research, and various seminars, conferences, and other events. The Center for Science and Society, which manages the Presidential Scholars Program, is a hub for researchers, scholars, and practitioners seeking to break down traditional disciplinary silos and enhance public understanding of science. The core of our program is our early career postdoctoral scholars who pursue independent research on mind, brain, and behavior. And they work at the intersection of the humanities, natural, and social sciences. Each scholar receives tailored support for their project from at least 2 faculty mentors from different departments who have the relevant knowledge and expertise to help guide their research. Current mentors come from neuroscience, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, medical humanities and ethics, music, philosophy, English and comparative literature, and many other disciplines. The scholars and PSSN faculty are central in organizing interdisciplinary events like the one you're attending today. Due to the pandemic, our programming this year is virtual, but please make sure you join us on April 6th for Neuroscience and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in Education, Promises and Challenges. Our final seminar in the Seminar in Society and Neuroscience series is due to take place in May, so please stay tuned for more information. I'm very pleased to announce the winners of this year's seed grants for interdisciplinary projects in society and neuroscience. We received many high-quality proposals, and we are very grateful to all who applied. 2 interdisciplinary research projects listed here will receive funding from the PSSN program, and we very much look forward to their results. Please visit our website to learn more about the program, sign up for our monthly newsletter, register for upcoming events, and access the vast video archive of previous seminars. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook for the latest updates about our activities. You can participate in the discussion at any time using the Q&A button, which I'm sure you're all familiar with now, located at the bottom of your screen, and then the moderator will share your questions during the Q&A period. The PSSN program would not be possible without support of leadership at Columbia, including President Lee Bollinger and our valued steering committee members, Peter Berman, Michael Goldberg, Carol Mason, Valerie Purdy-Greenaway, and Christopher Peacock. Faculty from across the university participate on the advisory committee, mentor our scholars, and volunteer to review and interview applicants. Thanks to all of you who have helped make this program an example of interdisciplinary achievement, including center staff, especially Senior Project Manager Joseph Sulik and the center's Associate Director, Melinda Miller. We will be providing ways to keep in touch in the chat box throughout the event. As some of you may be aware, Columbia graduate student workers are currently on strike. The Center for Science and Society supports the graduate workers' efforts to unionize and their demands for fair wages, increased health and childcare coverage, and neutral arbitration in cases of discrimination and harassment. We will also be using our chat box today to provide more information about the strike and ways to support the students' efforts. Now, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Dr. Raphaël Millière, one of our PSSN postdocs, is a philosopher interested in the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence. He received his PhD from the University of Oxford last year As a presidential scholar, he is investigating theoretical and empirical issues regarding spatial self-representation using virtual reality. He is also interested in the human-like capacities of artificial deep neural networks with a particular focus on the semantic competence of neural language models. Dr. Millière, the floor is yours.
So in May last year, the company OpenAI unveiled an algorithm called GPT-3. And GPT-3 is the latest development in a lineage of algorithms called language models that are designed to parse text written in natural language like English. And for some of them, including GPT-3 itself, designed also to generate text in natural language. In fact, GPT-3's text generation abilities were so impressive that a number of mainstream media outlets like the New York Times or the Guardian's published articles about its capacities at the time, some of which used somewhat sensationalistic headlines that might be misleading about what these models actually do. So here are some claims to fame of state-of-the-art language models, particularly GPT-3. It can generate fake news articles that humans can barely detect above chance. It can write, at least for a few paragraphs, what might be characterized as creative fiction. It can generate code for a computer program given natural language description of the function of that code, at least for simple tasks. And in some cases, it can answer general knowledge queries. So to give you a concrete example, I've taken the first paragraph of the abstract for this event and the first two words of the second paragraph, and I fed this as a prompt to GPT-3, prompting it to complete that sequence. And here is what it outputted. Unlike humans, GPT-3 is incapable of understanding the meaning of its own text, nor does it learn about the world through experience. GPT-3 is designed to emulate the superficial aspects of human language, not its substance. Therefore, it is more surprising that GPT-3's language is capable of communicating ideas with any degree of subtlety. So these are only 3 sentences, and the longer you let GPT-3 generate text, the easier it becomes to discriminate this from human-generated text. But nonetheless, you can see that these 3 sentences are very coherent, not only grammatically, but also topically. So at the risk of being extremely simplistic, I just want to mention 2 important ideas that got us to GPT-3. The first idea is the so-called distributional hypothesis from the 1950s, according to which words that occur in a similar context have a similar meaning. So one implication of that idea is that given a large enough corpus of text, it might be possible in principle from the statistical distribution of these words in the corpus to recover their meaning. And the second important development is that of artificial neural networks, which are alternatives to traditional symbolic algorithms using handcrafted rules and features. And artificial neural networks can learn from the bottom up from a data set to encode statistically salient features of that data set. And in the case that interests us today, the data set is a corpus of text. So that is what GPT-3 is. It is a very large artificial neural network that was trained on a vast corpus of text, including a significant subset of the internet and all of Wikipedia. And it is trained by sampling text sequences from that corpus and trying to predict what is the word that follows that text sequence, and then adjusting its internal parameters to minimize the error in that next word prediction mechanism. And in this process, by doing this repeatedly over millions of training events, it learns to represent general features of language. And after training, it can complete any prompt or input sequence in a way that is often quite compelling. So I cannot reasonably get into the technical details of GPT-3 in this very short introduction, but I think it is worth mentioning a very few simple elements of it. So inside its neural network, GPT-3 contains stacks of so-called decoder modules that implements a mechanism called self-attention, and that allows it to preferentially attend to various relationships or dependencies between words at various levels of abstraction, including syntactic and semantic relationships. And as it is processing a text sequence, an input sequence, each token from that sequence flows through the whole neural network and through all of these decoder modules, and gets turned into a contextual embedding that encodes its meaning within the context of the input sequence. And these contextual embeddings are then used to generate the text that plausibly follows from the input sequence. So knowing how these algorithms work raise interesting questions given their impressive performance. So what kind of linguistic or cognitive competence can we really ascribe to state-of-the-art language models like GPT-3? And in particular, can we say that language models learn and represent word meanings in the same way that humans do? Raising these questions also raises other practical questions about the implications of these issues, given the recent deployment of these models on a large scale for commercial applications. So we are delighted to have a wonderful panel of speakers today to help us navigate these complicated issues. All of our speakers are experts on these questions, but they also come from complementary and distinct disciplinary backgrounds, from computer science to neurolinguistics and psychology. Our first speaker is Melanie Mitchell, who is Davis Professor at the Santa Fe Institute and Professor of Computer Science on leave at Portland State University. Among many other research projects, Melanie Mitchell has done pioneering work on analogy making in algorithms and has recently connected this line of research with the recent development of artificial language models. So I will now hand it over to Professor Melanie Mitchell.
So thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here, and thanks to everyone who's listening. I'm going to ask some questions and not give all the answers, probably set up some of the questions that Brenden and Ev can answer in their talks. But my question is, how is it that we can take these language models like GPT-3 and figure out to what extent they are actually, quote, understanding language? So the whole field of AI was launched officially, in some sense, in 1956. This is a proposal for a workshop that was going to happen the following year by some of the pioneers of AI. They were very optimistic about the prospects. They proposed that 2 months, 10 men, literally men, would go spend a summer at Dartmouth College to look at some of the questions of artificial intelligence, such as how to make machines use language, form abstractions, concepts, et cetera, et cetera. And they proposed that they could make a significant advance on one or more of these problems if they work on it together for a summer. Well, clearly we're now maybe 7 decades later, more or less, and we still have all these things as open problems in AI. And in fact, one of the main organizers, John McCarthy, later said that the reason that progress was not as fast as they thought on this was that AI was harder than we think. And in particular, one of the hardest things seems to be natural language processing. Back in the 80s and that general era of AI, a lot of people were working on language understanding. This is a cover of a book by Roger Schank and Riesbeck, who were language researchers who were looking at story understanding. How is it that we could get machines to process text and answer questions about it, about the stories that they were told? But really in spite of the very complicated knowledge representation systems they devised for story understanding, the term understanding didn't really fit as to what these machines were actually doing. And you could really tell by the kinds of errors that the machines would make, that they weren't actually understanding language in the way that we humans do. This kind of thing prompted the philosopher Giancarlo Rota to ask, I wonder whether or when AI will ever crash the barrier of meaning, which is a lovely way of talking about sort of this seeming impenetrable wall between what our machines can do and what we humans can do, and that is to actually understand the meaning of the situations and the language that we encounter. So as Raphaël described, in the last 5 years or so, there's been really quite a revolution in natural language processing, mainly due to this so-called transformer language model architecture. And it's a complicated computer architecture that's based on neural networks, that is very large networks of simulated neurons, very simple simulated neurons that are connected with weighted connections. And GPT-3 is only one of many such language models. It happens to be a very large one. It has about 175 billion parameters, that is essentially weights between simulated neurons that are changed through this training that Raphaël described. And the scale of the network itself is rivaled by the amount of data it's trained on. It's trained on text from the web and from collections of books and other resources amounting to hundreds of billions of words. So it's really hard for us to really understand the scale of what this machine has been trained on. OpenAI was generous enough to make accessible an interface to GPT-3 to me and many other people who are doing research in computer understanding. And this is what you get when you log on to it, something that says playground, and a place where you can type in text, and GPT-3 will complete your text prompts. So I gave it one of the stories that was in the book by Roger Schenck et al., slightly rewritten. And I started by telling it was a true story, followed by some questions and answers. Here's the story. A man went into a restaurant and ordered a hamburger rare. When it arrived, it was burned to a crisp. The man stormed out of the restaurant without paying. Okay, so a very short story, sad short story. So this bold-faced text is the prompt that I type in, and you'll see that I also added a question. Why did the man storm out of the restaurant? Because I wanted to see, what did GPT-3, quote unquote, understand this story? And here's what it answered in this non-bold-faced text: because he was angry that his hamburger was burned. Yep. Why did the man go to the restaurant? My question. GPT-3, because he was hungry. Who made the hamburger? The cook. Okay, none of this is mentioned in the story note. This is all reading between the lines of figuring out what's going on in this situation. How did the hamburger get to the man's table? A waiter brought it to him. So clearly there's some knowledge here about how restaurants work that's not contained in the story itself. Why was the hamburger burned? The cook burned it. Okay, so this is kind of the reason, this gives you a sort of a flavor of why people are so excited about GPT-3, that you can actually give it text, and not only can it complete text, as Raphaël showed, it can also answer questions about the text. And it does give the feeling of talking to an entity that actually understands the language that you're communicating with. So language model revolution has sort of taken over the field of natural language processing in AI. There's something called the General Language Understanding Evaluation Benchmark, GLUE, which is a widely used set of tasks and data sets that people use to evaluate their natural language understanding programs. There's many different kinds of language tasks. Okay, so like paraphrasing a text, or figuring out similarity between two texts, or answering, talking about entailment, meaning sort of logical consequences of text, and so on. And this GLUE data set, this whole evaluation benchmark, was put together several years ago, but very quickly, if you rank by score on this benchmark, the top teams that have submitted programs to it, the top ones are all now these large pre-trained neural language models, sort of akin to GPT-3. And here's where humans sit, number 15 under all of these language models. So this was humans who were recruited through Amazon Mechanical Turk and other crowdsourcing sources to do these same tasks. So all these humans are not scoring as highly as these machines. So in order to try and figure out why this was the case, a new data set, a benchmark was created called superglue, which is even much harder than the original glue benchmark. And here's the current ranking. And still the top two are these language models, based programs, and here's humans. So this has generated a lot of kind of consternation in the field, as well as hyperbolic headlines, such as Microsoft's AI model has outperformed humans in natural language understanding. AI will soon outperform us in disciplines we thought were uniquely human, like language, and AI is getting brainier, and soon it's going to leave us in the dust. But the real question that people in AI and psychology, neuroscience, so on, are asking about these programs is, do these language models that seem to perform so well on these tasks actually understand language in any meaningful sense of the word understand? There's been a slew of papers trying to probe what's going on here, and a lot of people are finding that actually the neural networks that are trained on these tasks and are doing better than the human baseline are often taking what's called shortcuts. That is, they're learning statistical correlations in the data sets that allow them to give the right answer, but for the wrong reason, if you will. In fact, here's a paper called Right for the Wrong Reason. And one of those tasks, the natural language inference, the entailment tasks, this group, for instance, found some very subtle, spurious correlations that could be used to kind of pass the test without actually understanding anything about the language itself, just having statistical correlations among words and phrases. And some people have actually made the analogy of Clever Hans, who was a turn of the century horse who supposedly was able to do arithmetic, but people finally discovered that Clever Hans was actually responding to subtle clues that the trainer's body language was given and not actually understanding anything about mathematics. And that this has now become a metaphor in AI for programs that seem to understand or be able to achieve some skill, but are not actually doing it at all the same way that humans are, instead using kind of what people might call spurious correlations in the data. And many have kind of attacked GPT-3 for similar kinds of tricks, what you might call cheap tricks or clever tricks. This paper in MIT Tech Review claimed that OpenAI's language generator has no idea what it's talking about. And you can actually see that. I mean, here I showed you this little conversation I had with GPT-3 where it seemed so well to understand the story. But when I went on to ask it a few more questions like, did the man eat the hamburger? So remember, the man ordered the hamburger, but it was burned to a crisp and he stormed out without paying. So the question is, did he eat the hamburger? GPT-3 probably disagrees with you, thinking that he did. Who paid for the hamburger? The man did, even though he stormed out of the restaurant without paying. Did the man leave a tip? He did. Well, some of these seem pretty counterintuitive. And in fact, GPT-3 can sometimes seem very human-like in its responses, but other times seem very non-human-like and seem to have missed the point entirely. So it's still quite inconsistent. So the questions I want to leave you with, which I'm sure that Brenden and Ev will address in the next two talks, are what actually is needed for language understanding, okay? Do we need some of the things that people have proposed, like some kind of core knowledge of space and time and objects? Do we need models of the world that we can simulate? Clearly, GPT-3 is doing none of these. Do we need a theory of mind? Like when I asked the GPT-3, why did the person storm out of the restaurant? And said he was angry about his burnt hamburger, but does it have any sense of human psychology, or is it just sort of parroting things in its training data that is associated with the text in the question? And in fact, a recent paper about language models called them stochastic parrots, which is in some sense a great term, but maybe underestimating them a little bit. Do we need what's called grounding? Do we need symbols like language to be grounded in the world, to have some referent in the world, or connecting language to perception and action in the way that we humans do? Or can GPT-3, which is in essence equivalent to a brain in a vat with no perceptual sensory apparatus or no ability to act in the world, can it possibly understand language? Do we need embodiment? Do we need some kind of body to map the language on, to map our concepts on in the physical world? These are all really important but unanswered questions. And some people would claim, no, we don't need any of those. We just need more parameters and more data to train these language models, and they will capture everything about human language. So I think this really focuses the debate that we're having in this language processing and intelligence community about what exactly it takes and what's the future of our field. Then the question is, how is it that we can probe a system like GPT-3 to see if it's actually understanding? It doesn't have a body, but that shouldn't prejudice us against it. At least that's not what Alan Turing proposed in his famous Turing test. He proposed that the computer or machine and the human who are competing in the Turing test should be hidden from the judge, so that the judge doesn't have the kind of prejudice against something that's we know doesn't have a body or is not anything like us. How do we actually probe it fairly without being fooled by its cheap tricks? And finally, what do we actually mean by understanding? I'll leave you with a quote from AI pioneer Marvin Minsky, which he wrote in 1980, but I think is still extremely true. He says, though pre-scientific idea germs like believe, know, and mean are useful in daily life, they seem technically too coarse to support powerful theories. Real as self or understand may seem to us today, they are only first steps towards better concepts. Our confusions about these notions stem from a burden of traditional ideas inadequate to this tremendously difficult enterprise. This is still a formative period for our ideas about mind. I think that's just as true today as when he wrote it. And I hope that this seminar and this whole program, this interdisciplinary program, will help us better form our ideas about mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. So I will now introduce our second speaker, Brenden Lake, who is assistant professor of psychology and data science at New York University and research scientist at Facebook AI Research. And in his research, he's interested in gaining a better understanding of human cognitive abilities with computational models, and in return, building algorithms that can learn and think in more human-like ways. And particularly, he recently worked on the representation of word meanings in human and language models. So I now hand over to Brenden.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and this event is on such a timely topic. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. My talk today is based on an article with the same title, Word Meaning in Minds and Machines, with my NYU colleague, Greg Murphy. And I can only cover a fraction of what's in this paper. So if you're interested in these ideas, I encourage you to check out the paper. It's on arXiv and was accepted at Psychological Review last week. What am I going to talk about? Brenden Lake, a professor of psychology and data science at NYU, is speaking at Columbia today. His talk is called Word Meaning in Minds and Machines, and he will discuss what makes us human. He will talk about a variety of topics, including how computers are interconnected, how computers work, and what makes humanity unique in the world of consciousness. So, as you may have guessed, the part in bold wasn't written by me. It was written by an NLP, a natural language processing system, particular GPT-2 from OpenAI. And it does a pretty good job at guessing what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what makes us human and what makes humanity unique, and compare ourselves with machines in terms of understanding word meaning, I'm not going to talk about consciousness, but it's impressive. Given the successes of systems like GPT-2 and 3, are we done? Do modern NLP systems understand the meaning of words as people do? And relatedly, can they serve as psychological theories of word meaning? Can we use them to understand ourselves? These are the key questions that I want to talk about in my presentation. And here's a quick primer on deep learning for natural language processing, in particular language models. Raphaël and Melanie touched on this a bit, but I also have a figure of BERT and GPT. And the key idea here is that words are vectors, or that these models have word embeddings. They have a low-dimensional vector to represent each word. In terms of BERT over there on the left, which is the system from Google, if you look at the bright blue boxes at the bottom, those are actually the embeddings for each of the input words: the dog, mask, the cat. And what BERT is trained to do is to try to fill in the mask with the missing word. In this case, it takes those initial isolated word embeddings and they mix, and the transformer architecture mixes them together across multiple layers of processing. And ultimately at the top, you get higher level representations that are trained to try to predict what those missing words might be, in this case, chases. The GPT is similar, although it doesn't try to predict a missing word in the middle of a sentence. It tries to predict every word given its preceding words in that sentence. And the scale of these models can be hundreds of millions of trainable parameters to billions. An issue is that these systems are trained only on text to predict missing words. And when we use a word as a person, we expect other people to understand the connection of that word with the world and also to world knowledge, not just its relationship to other words in text. In the paper, we put forward 4 desiderata for any psychological theory of word meaning, and we analyze NLP models with respect to these desiderata. So here's a scenario that motivates the 4 desiderata. Imagine you're at a dinner party, and you might look at this table and say, that knife is dirty. Now, to say this, you need to identify some key objects. You need to identify the knives, the forks, the place settings, the speck of food on the knife, and retrieve the words for them. So this brings us to our first desideratum, that word representation should support describing scenes and understanding their descriptions. Upon hearing your words, someone might offer you a knife, a new knife, that one over there on the right, which brings us to the second desideratum, that word representation should support responding to instructions and requests appropriately. Someone can actually act upon the words that you say. But this might not be the type of knife that you had in mind. So you might respond by saying, actually, I was hoping for a butter knife. Now, butter knife, that phrase of 2 words, is an example of a conceptual combination. It's combining 2 words together to form a new, more complex concept. In this case, butter knife, but we do this all the time: steak knife, cheese knife, Jello knife. People can understand and produce novel combinations of 2 concepts. And this is going to be our third desiderata. Word representation should support conceptual combination. Then you might tell your kids that when you're setting a place setting at a table, forks go on the left, knives go on the right, with the hope that next time they will remember this fact. So this brings us to the fourth desideratum, that word representation should support changing one's beliefs about the world based on linguistic inputs. Let's dive deeper into these 4 desiderata. So first, word representation should support describing scenes and understanding their descriptions. In the example, this was like producing a description, that knife is dirty, when looking at that place setting. And the language models discussed so far, GPT, BERT, and so on, they have no way of interfacing with the visual world or the world in general. They're just trained on text. But unfortunately, there have been a lot of recent work in a multimodal NLP, where systems can be trained on multiple modalities of information. So I want to say a couple words about how NLP approaches would go about describing a scene. So for a scene description model, what it takes as input is an image like this, and it has what's usually a convolutional neural network to encode that image with some features organized in space. And this seeds a recurrent neural network or a model like GPT that can go through and produce a caption for that scene one word at a time, like a umbrella is sitting on the ground. And as it's producing these words, it's attending over different locations in the image. And after training on hundreds of thousands of images paired with captions, it learns some very interesting things. Like when it's actually producing the word umbrella, it's paying attention to the umbrella in the scene. Or when it's producing the word ground, it's looking more at the ground in the scene, suggesting that it perhaps has learned to ground its word representations in the real world. So do these grounded NLP systems understand the meaning of words like you do? They're trained on massive quantities of text and images, and as I said, they do have a connection with the world that other types of models don't, which is promising. But I want to focus on two words in particular, suitcase and umbrella, to help probe the knowledge of these systems, but I could have chosen a lot of other words, dog, or Melanie sometimes uses the example of a bridge, to probe understanding of systems. In this case, let's look at suitcase. This system was trained on 1,600 scenes with at least one suitcase in them and 5 captions for each of those scenes. And these are new images that I fed to the system. And it's quite successful in a lot of cases, that it can look at this image in the top left and say a pile of luggage sitting on top of a pile of luggage. A little odd, but certainly correct. Or a couple of cats are laying in a suitcase. That's a keen observation to notice that there are 2 cats and they're laying inside the suitcase, again, for an image that it was never trained on. But there are also failures when looking at other types of images. That when you present it with this image of a toy blue car, it captions it a blue car with a suitcase on top of it. So it confuses the fact that the hood of the car, when open, has a similar profile to a suitcase with an open flap. Although certainly as a human, we wouldn't call it a car with a suitcase on top of it. That's clearly wrong. Or over here, we have a wooden cabinet with a suitcase on top of it. And I think it's getting confused by these stacks of luggages in the training set. And you can see the resemblance to this wooden cabinet, but confusing a suitcase with a wooden cabinet or a wooden drawer would be a very unfortunate and heavy mistake to make as a person. Also, to look at umbrella, the system's been trained on over 2,700 scenes with umbrellas in them, and it can, again, succeed on new images like a umbrella that is sitting on the ground or a man holding an umbrella in a park. You can recognize umbrellas in lots of different settings. But then we can show it something very different than what it was trained on. In this case, it's more of a failure of analogy than identifying an umbrella directly, but it turns out that animals in nature sometimes construct ad hoc umbrellas when it's raining, like a frog will take shelter under a leaf, or a monkey under a leaf, or a frog under a flower. And the question is, does it see the analogy or the resemblance between these scenes and someone holding up an umbrella? Well, they're pretty clearly failures. Here it says a bird is perched on top of a bird feeder, a close-up of a vase with a flower in it. It actually says the word umbrella here, but calls it a bear. And it's more than just not describing these things as umbrellas right off the bat. You can take an object recognition system that has a forced choice over a bunch of different categories, and it sees no connection between these scenes and umbrellas, where a person does. And that's why we find images like this very striking. So it doesn't really seem to be understanding the suitcase or umbrella in the way that we would. And for the second desideratum, I want to talk about how word representation should support responding to instructions and requests appropriately. And this is in the example of when someone went to fetch you a new knife or a clean knife. But none of the models discussed so far can turn words into actions, even the model that can look at an image of the visual world. They just simply generate text. And here we actually want a system that can generate action. But you can use a similar technique to what I described for the image captioning case, where you could have a system that looks at a state of the world where the little pink triangle is the agent, and these are various objects it can try to move to, and it gets an instruction, push a green small square, of which in a language, a recurrent neural network is going to encode. And then you have another recurrent neural network like GPT, in this case, producing the actions one at a time in order to correctly fulfill that response given the state of the world, where it's attending over all this information. And it can learn to successfully find the target in a scene like this. You could train NLP systems to follow instructions. Laura Ruiz, a grad student in my lab, has shown that the learned word representations in models like this are not as flexible or abstract enough as we would need them to be as models of word learning. So this was a paper that was published at Neuroscience this past year, where Laura trained up a system like this on a benchmark she came up with called GScan, where I'll just show you two of her results. One case, she trained a system to walk to various places, like walk to the small green square over hundreds of thousands of episodes, but it only trains to walk to things that are in 3 quadrants of the grid and not in the 4th quadrant. Then if you test it on the 4th quadrant for the first time, now its representation of walk isn't flexible enough that it completely fails. It never successfully goes to a location in that quadrant. Or you might ask about a word like spinning, walk to the green circle while spinning, where even if the system is trained on 50 examples of doing something while spinning with that adverb modifying the verb, it is very unsuccessful at doing this in new scenarios and doesn't learn an abstract enough representation of spinning. For the third desideratum, we discussed how word representation should support conceptual combination. This is like the butter knife phrase I mentioned earlier. Compositionality is critical in language, making infinite use of finite means, and our focus is on word meanings. And we wanted to take a basic case, like composing 2 words together through conceptual combination. So what is a conceptual combination? Like butter knife, you could have a red dog, where you could recognize a red dog as the correct combination of red and dog. And in this case, it might just be changing the color feature of a dog, but now that it's red. But in other cases, it's not so easy. For instance, apartment dog. There's not just some apartment feature in dog, which you have to modify. Instead, it relies on world knowledge. And you know that this dog here on the bottom would be a good New York City apartment dog that's small and fluffy and so on. But in order to do this, it's a quite a sophisticated process. Perhaps transformers can do it because they can make arbitrary combinations of words. But previous approaches in NLP that tried averaging word embeddings or weighting them in various ways are not successful at these more sophisticated types of combinations. Well, we wanted to test these transformers, things like BERT and GPT. So we used items from a classic paper of my co-author, Greg Murphy, that studied emergent features in conceptual combination as a particularly interesting test, where you could have complex concepts like an empty store. And you know that empty stores are associated with a property like losing money. Empty stores lose money. And that's represented by a strong association or a thick line. But empty things don't typically lose money, and stores don't typically lose money, but empty stores do. So here's a property that isn't typical of either of the 2 elements, but it is typical of the compound. Or dirty bowls are sticky, but dirty things can sometimes be sticky, but not always. And bowls can sometimes be sticky, but not always, but it's much more strongly associated with dirty bowls. So Murphy had a set of items that he validated with human judgments that were more typical of the compound than the individual elements. And thus it seemed to suggest that these features are emergent or they rely on world knowledge. And we looked at how GPT-2 does on these types of tests. We gave it these forced choice judgments to see what property is more, what object it's most typical of. And it only got 46% correct in these forced choice judgments. And it made errors like losing money is more typical of a regular store than an empty store. Or our sticky is more typical of clean bowls rather than dirty bowls. Or our rusty is more typical of new saws than ancient saws. So we haven't tested GPT-3 yet. I hope someone is able to do that and see if it does any better. But it does seem like it is not forming the right properties for these compounds, even though it has some experience in the millions or billions of words. It likely has seen these complex concepts before in some sense. For the last desideratum, we discuss how word representation should support changing one's beliefs about the world in response to linguistic input. So this link is needed because language is one of the main sources in which we get inputs about our beliefs. And we might be told forks go on the left and knives go on the right, for instance. So how can an NLP system acquire beliefs? Well, you might imagine that it might predict dolphins are fish initially. It might represent a dolphin like a fish, where if fish is the masked out word. And then to get a correction that dolphins are actually mammals based on its training data. So do corrections like this lead to accurate beliefs about dolphins and mammals and other types of entities. Seemingly not, BERT seems to change its beliefs based on small differences in the wording, suggesting they're not really genuine beliefs at all. And it's not clear how you can open up the model with its millions of parameters and figure out a way to fix this. And that if you say sharks are fish, but dolphins are, it knows that a dolphin is a mammal as opposed to a bird or fish. But then change the wording around a little bit. Sharks are fish and dolphins are birds. Sharks are fish while dolphins are birds. Dolphins are mammals, that's right. A dolphin is a fish. Even with extra syntactic cues to help, it is completely inconsistent and doesn't really seem to have genuine beliefs. So wrapping up, I want to emphasize that current NLP systems can do amazing things, but they alone are not sufficient as a psychological theory of word meaning. And this may not concern many researchers and practitioners with enough data, with large enough scale pattern recognition. You may be able to solve particular applications, but if we want a model of psychological semantics can be a higher bar worth reaching for, especially if we want machines to genuinely understand what we are saying or genuinely understand what they are saying. So I just want to make 3 suggestions for moving forward. Semantic representations need to be based on content, information that makes contact with the world and not just words connected to other words. Word meanings have internal structure, parts, and relations, and must be grounded in perception and action and be capable of flexible combination. And NLP systems would be well served with a more human-like conceptual basis for word meaning. Thank you very much, and thank my wonderful co-author, Greg Murphy.
Thank you very much, Brenden. I will now introduce our 3rd speaker, Ed Fedorenko, who is Frederick A. and Carol J. Middleton Carey Development Associate Professor of Neuroscience at the MIT. And Ed Fedorenko's research focuses on the cognitive and neural mechanisms that enable us to produce and understand language. In particular, she has done crucial work in identifying brain regions that are functionally specialized for language processing, and has recently explored the use of language models as computational models of language processing in the brain. Now I'll give the floor to Ed Fedorenko.
So in my 15 minutes, I would like to first clarify what we may mean by speaking or understanding a language by highlighting the sharp divide that exists between language and thought. And a lot of this work was carried out by a former postdoc, Dan Blanc, and a graduate student, Anya Ivanova. And the reason I want to do this is that I think this point has important implications for whether or not artificial language models are promising as models of human language processing. And then I'm going to talk about some recent work where we find that some ANNs provide a strong fit to human neural responses during language comprehension, suggesting that they may serve as quite useful computationally explicit hypotheses about how language may be solved by the human brain. And this work was led by Martin Schrempf and a crew of other graduate students at MIT. So starting with some very basics, there are 2 things we do with language. We produce language and we understand language. When we produce language, we start out with some thought, conceptual representation, and we draw on our language knowledge to convert this thought into a string of words or an utterance. And once planned, we send the utterance down to our motor system, which controls our articulators or our hands, allowing us to say, sign, or write our message. When we understand language, we start with perception, from which we extract utterances and subsequently infer conceptual representations. So there are these lower level perceptual and motor foundations of the language system that deal with the input and output. And then there's these higher level production comprehension mechanisms. And these are the mechanisms I generally refer to when I talk about the language system. So we have long known that a set of brain regions in the left hemisphere in most individuals are important for language. Using brain imaging approaches like fMRI, we can identify the system in just a few minutes of scanning by, for example, contrasting a response, neural response when individuals read or listen to sentences compared to stimuli that are perceptually matched but lack meaning and structure, like a sequence of non-words or sequences in a language unfamiliar to the participant. And this set of brain areas exhibit a few important properties. I already mentioned they respond robustly during comprehension, either auditory or visual, and production, either in speaking or writing or signing, if we're talking a sign language. A similar network emerges across a large range of typologically diverse languages, suggesting some universal features. The regions of the system are very strongly functionally integrated, suggesting that they work together in the service of some common goal. And then finally, if this network is damaged in adulthood, we end up with deficits in comprehension, production, or both. Now, one of the questions I've tackled in my work over the last decade is whether this network, which is critically important for language, also supports our ability to think. Now, what do we mean by thought? Well, different people mean different things, but let's just try to be kind of broad and comprehensive here. So aside from our perceptual intelligence supporting our ability to recognize objects or faces or voices, and motor intelligence supporting our ability to physically interact with the world, we can do math. We can engage in logical reasoning. We can solve novel problems. We have executive functions like attention, working memory, and inhibitory control, as well as planning for the future or decision making. We can appreciate music. We can interact cooperatively with conspecifics and figure out what someone else is thinking or feeling. We can acquire totally evolutionarily new skills like reading or coding computers. And of course, we have a rich knowledge of the world, of the objects that exist in the world and their properties, of events and their typical orderings, and of things that are possible in real worlds versus only in our imagination. So does our language system support any or all of these complex abilities? And many have argued that the answer is yes, and I'm going to argue that the answer is a resounding no. There are two sources of data that I will show you for this claim. One comes from fMRI, which is a method that's actually really well suited for probing relationships between cognitive processes. So first we can investigate the role of the language system in different aspects of thought and reasoning by looking at how brain regions that respond robustly to language respond to a multitude of diverse non-linguistic tasks, tapping these abilities that I mentioned. So we find language responsive areas in each individual participant, and then we see how they respond to these diverse domains, including perceptual, motor, and cognitive abilities. And everything is here plotted relative to 0, which is a fixation baseline. We're just looking at a blank screen. In dark gray is a response to reading sentences or listening to sentences. They're similar magnitude. And in light gray is a response to reading non-words like blicket or florp. And now in different colors, I'll show you responses to these diverse kinds of conditions. And this is pulling data from quite a few years of investigating this question. So here are the responses to these diverse tasks. So you can see that these brain areas that work really hard when we process language work about as hard as we're solving a math problem or listening to music or holding information in working memory as they do when we're looking at a blank screen. We can draw a line from the control non-word reading condition. And you can see that the only conditions that elicit a response above that kind of a baseline are some conditions that probe visual event semantics. So this is processing pictures and videos that contain meaningful events. And I'll come back to this point in a second. It's important to note that all of these conditions elicit highly robust responses in other parts of the brain. It just so happens that those regions are distinct from the regions that support language processing. Now, a complementary approach for addressing this question comes from individuals with aphasia. So we can say, okay, if somebody has a language system that is not properly functioning, do they also exhibit problems with some of these aspects of reasoning and thought? And the most informative are cases of what's known as global aphasia. So this is a kind of aphasia that you get from severe damage, extensive damage to the perisylvian cortex, typically as a result of a large stroke. And Rosemary Varley has been investigating this population for a number of years now. And strikingly, and so we can ask, right, whether these individuals with severely impaired both comprehension and production, how do they perform on doing math or reasoning about others' minds? And strikingly, in spite of these incredibly severe linguistic deficits, these patients seem to be able to do pretty much everything else. They can do math, logic, problem solve. They have executive functions intact. They can appreciate structure and music. They can understand others' minds, and they understand how the world works. And so this is relevant to the point that I mentioned where some meaningful visual events do elicit a above baseline response in the language regions, but it seems like that response is not functionally critical, meaning that you can take the language system away effectively through this extensive damage, and there is some alternative representation of world knowledge that we can rely on to solve these kinds of problems. And so the only thing that these patients lack is effectively the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format. or to extract meaningful information from other people's linguistic productions. And these findings, of course, align well with the picture that emerges in the fMRI studies. Now, discovering that circuits that support language understanding are exquisitely specialized for language is important. It helped to rule out a large number of hypotheses from the field about how the system works. But how do we go beyond these verbal descriptions of what computations a language system may support? And this has long been a challenge. And the reason is that until recently, we lacked adequate computationally explicit accounts of how meaning might be extracted from language. And then just a few years ago, everything changed. Suddenly, artificial neural networks models of language trained on word prediction tasks appeared to form representations that at least approximated meaning well enough to answer questions, generate free-form text, and translate between languages, as we've seen in the previous two talks. And the highest performing models were these transform architectures like BERT and GPT style models. So I thought that these advances were really exciting and opening many doors towards understanding of how language may work. But then an avalanche of criticisms has started coming down about how these models don't really understand language because they can't think. And different demonstrations emerged showing that these models can do math, they can solve logic puzzles, and they're really not impressive on common sense reasoning. I found these criticisms puzzling because after all, these are, well, these language models, they're models of language. They're not models of human thought. They're built to extract statistical rules and distributional properties of language, and that they do remarkably well. And as I told you, it so happens that the human language system, well, it also doesn't do math, and it also doesn't reason about the world. So I think whatever the human language system does matches really well with the scope of what ANN language models do. And given that, it seemed worthwhile to see how well such models could capture human neural activity during language processing. Martin Schrimpf led the effort to do just that. So he adopted an approach that proved highly successful in vision, which he and colleagues termed integrative benchmarking. And the idea behind this approach is that in order to link computation and brain function, it's not enough to test a single model on a single data set. Instead, we want to look for consistent trends in performance across many different models and many different kinds of neural or behavioral data, together with their performance on the proposed core computational function of the brain system in question. So we took a stab at reverse engineering the brain mechanisms of language processing in a similar way to how it's been done in vision. And a few other groups have now started doing this as well. So we examined 43 state-of-the-art language models against 3 human neural data sets by effectively feeding the same stimuli that experimental participants saw in whatever imaging modality they were tested in, fMRI or intracranial recordings, to a bunch of these models, and then fitting a regression from the models to the human neural data and testing how well it generalizes on untrained, on unseen portions of the data. So first we ask how well these different models perform on our data sets, and here's what we find. So this is plotting normalized predictivity where the ceiling is estimated based on the internal reliability of the data set. And 2 things are worth noting. So first, models vary quite a lot in how well they fit the brain data. And second, some models in the class of unidirectional transformers, like GPT large and GPT-2 XL, already get to the estimated ceiling level here. Next, building on work that has suggested strongly a core role for predictive processing in language, we asked, do the models that perform best on a next word prediction task also provide the best fit to human neural data? The answer is yes. So there is a very strong relationship between this computational task performance and brain scores, neural predictivity. But is this next word prediction test special, or is performance on any language benchmark sophisticated enough will give you this kind of a relationship? The answer seems to be that it is indeed special. So we examined performance on the glue benchmarks that Melanie mentioned, which include grammaticality, judgment tests, sentence similarity tasks, judgment tasks, and so on, inference. And these really don't predict neural scores in spite of the fact that they do elicit variance across models. So this is just showing individual glue tasks. None of them reliably predict brain scores. The blue one is the next word prediction here. To us, this suggests that optimizing for predictive representations may be a critical objective, not just for the biological language systems, but also for in silico language models. So I've shown you that language processing is separate from thought in the human brain. And I've argued that ANN language models may serve as useful computationally explicit hypotheses about how language processing may be achieved in the human brain. So where do we go from now? So along with my collaborators, some of whom are shown here, we're taking kind of a three-pronged approach. So on the one hand, we're pushing on the data collection front. Although there is numerous data sets that are available across fMRI, MEG, even intracranial recordings these days, most of them were not collected with the goal of relating neural representations to those from ANN language models and are really suboptimal in many ways. In particular, what we want are data with very high SNR, and we need robust estimates of neural response to individual phrases and sentences, which generally requires multiple repetitions of each stimulus. And so we're focusing on intracranial approaches supplemented with fMRI and MEG approaches, and also using the latest machine learning algorithms to select stimuli in a way that would best allow us to discriminate among models or model classes. Second, building on this integrative benchmarking approach, we are now dissecting high-performing models to understand what are the critical features that lead to a good model-to-brain fit. Is it some component of the architecture? Is it a particular training regimen? Is it a particular optimization function? So far, it seems that the particular optimization function and architecture are the best contenders for predicting, contributing the most to human-to-brain fit, in spite of the fact that most of these models have been construed as primarily being successful because of all the training that they get. And here we're turning to basically well-established methods from cognitive science and neuropsychology by creating minimal pair comparisons across diverse model properties to really isolate the features that are necessary and sufficient for human-like language understanding. And third, although as I have argued in humans, language appears to be implemented in a system that's distinct from the one that implements complex thought. Of course, ultimately, we want to understand how the whole system works. And so Josh Tenenbaum and colleagues and some other groups have long been working on modeling different aspects of human thought. And we're starting to think about how to link those models, which typically rely on symbolic or at least sub-symbolic representations, with models, with these statistical language models, with the hope of developing a more complete model of the human brain that we can use to test hypotheses about cognition as a whole. And with this, I'll stop. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ev. So thank you to our three speakers for wonderful presentations. This is a perfect segue into my first question, and these different perspectives have been set up nicely for that, which is really, what is the fair comparison between state-of-the-art language models like GPT-3 and humans? Is it a comparison to the whole system, as Melanie and Brenden have been inclined to make, or is it a comparison to a subsystem like the language network? And specifically, when we compare encodings from language models to human representations, should we compare these to the kind of linguistic representations that feed into beliefs and actions, or the kind of representations at the subpersonal level that the language network makes use of? Okay, Brenden, do you want to give your answer now?
Sure. Well, I don't think there's just one fair comparison. It's more or less what I wanted to say, that I don't think there's a single test where we want to run and say, oh, now we know it's human-like, now we know it's not. And in cognitive science, when you put forward a computational model and you want to compare it to some type of mental process, it's not just one test, it's sort of the body of a phenomena that's able to account for. And I think there's a lot of differences in the way that these models are trained and types of experiences that children get when they're learning language, and to set up a fair playing field in a sense is going to be very difficult. But I think ultimately, if one wants use them to understand human cognition and development in the fullest way, or make a claim that it really learns in a human-like way, or understands language in a human-like way. And it should be able to learn from the same type of language experience that a child gets as a child is developing, with addition to other types of sensory experience, and produce similar types of behavior. So I think that itself would be a fair test, and nobody has really looked at things in that way.
Ev, do you, if we can hear you now.
Can you guys hear me now? Is this okay? I'm just using the normal mic. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I am very much in agreement with what Brenden said, but in terms of trying, I mean, I think it's really important. The separation between reasoning and language is really important, because I think there's so much misguided theorizing about what a language exposed to just linguistic input should be able to do. And it's just not what the language system does humans, right? Like there is a separation, very clear separation between reasoning, all sorts of reasoning, physical reasoning, social reasoning, and so on, and the system that tracks statistical regularities about language. Relatedly, I didn't mention this, but another property of the language system is that the context that affects the processing of the current input is relatively short. It's only on the order of about 6 words. In English, it's probably bits. Words is probably just a, easy operationalization, but systems that support complex thought must have longer integration windows. And there are systems in our brain that have that property, including, for example, what's known the default mode network. And so there is an emergence of ideas about what the language system could provide input to for further reasoning on the representations that we extract from linguistic input, like whatever sentences or stories. But I think without making that distinction clear, there's just going to be keep being some muddling in the arguments that have been made.
So yes, Melanie, I also have a follow-up question that also directly relates to what you were saying. But if you want to, go ahead for this first question.
Should I?
Sure, yes, of course.
Oh, okay. I found all of this really interesting. There's been a lot of discussion in psychology and psycholinguistics about the role of metaphor, and it's kind of our tendency to use metaphors that map onto physical states of our bodies, like warmth, using it metaphorically, things like that, and we might hypothesize that in order to create new metaphors or to thoroughly understand metaphors, you would need more than just this kind of statistical association between words. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is how we could use the idea of metaphor as kind of a probe into the human-like or unhuman-likeness of some of these language models. And I'd be interested in hearing what Ev thinks about that connection between metaphors and physicality and physical action, physical groundedness, because it sort of sounds like she's saying, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. It's actually separate. So.
Ev, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I don't think we have all the answers yet, but like in general, non-literal understanding is a lot less well understood than extracting meaning from a literal string. That said, I mean, one compelling source of evidence or sources of evidence come from individuals with very different developmental experiences who seem to arrive at conceptual representations very similar to those of kids who've grown up with all of the sensory and motor experiences available to them. So to me, that suggests both that on the one hand, it can be the case that information from all the modalities is important to arrive at kind of a complete model of the world, but also that perhaps language is a really great source of that information. Like we can certainly use language to exchange thoughts, right? So in that sense, it's necessarily linked. So when I'm talking about the separability, I think it's a separability between the cognitive processes that are used to just do these kind of local pattern matching in language to find the units, which we can then interpret with respect to what we know words mean, what we know constructions mean, and then take those representations, presumably now in a more abstract format, and structure them in a way to solve an analogy problem, or figure out a causal structure of events in a narrative or something like that. So it's not quite answering your question. I'm just trying to kind of channel some of the relevant things to help us think about it.
So I have a follow-up question that relates both to Brendan's answer and to something you discussed, Melanie, about how do we assess these models? How do we evaluate them? There is always this issue with deep neural networks, but how do we go from performance to competence? There is a kind of inference there that's not easy to make. And Melanie, you mentioned that these models now outperform humans on these so-called natural language understanding benchmarks, prompting questions about whether these benchmarks really evaluate natural language understanding. So is the future of evaluation really in benchmarking? Are there other ways to evaluate these models? Also because with models like GPT-3, the importance of the prompt is increasingly emphasized. And now you have people who do what they call prompt engineering to try to find the best prompts, and saying it's in fact difficult to know. It's easy to know what GPT-3 can do, but difficult to know what it cannot do because it might depend on finding the right prompt. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the prompt engineering to me is evidence of non-humanness, because humans are so flexible in their ability to understand, what, say, someone else is asking. So that's one way in which it's very different from us. I think it's, there's two ways that you could understand what these models are doing. One is just behaviorally, the way that we're, looking at how they do on benchmarks and so on. And another one is actually looking under the hood and trying to get some theories of how they're actually operating, and to see what have they actually learned, and are they just stochastic parrots, or are they doing something different? Are they actually building some kind of representation of the world through this absorption of language? And we don't yet know how to do that. And there's a whole area of now natural language processing, which is focuses on understanding how these models actually work. And somebody called one version of it BERTology, which is the study of BERT, which is one of these big language models. But I think that's, it's a growing area, and it's just really beginning.
I agree with Melanie there that we do want to go under the hood and try to understand the representations and do psychology on these models and try to see what their internal representations are like. I do think benchmarking is not going to go away, and benchmarks are always going to be limited in that when models are evaluated by the score they get on something, people are going to try to engineer the models to get the best scores, and ultimately the benchmarks are going to lose their value over time because maximizing that score may no longer correlate to things that are of interest. But it's crucial for getting quantitative evaluation of different approaches. Benchmarks like ImageNet in particular for vision have moved the field forward tremendously. But I think there needs to be more variety of benchmarks. I do think what GPT-3 is able to do in terms of prompt engineering, and that with things like glue, usually it's the case that you take BERT that's trained just to predict future missing words, and then you fine tune it on task one, you fine tune it on task two, and the model ultimately just does one of the tasks, right? I don't think that's very human-like, because we just get a new task and there we go. We can flexibly start reasoning and using our language in a different way. And GPT-3 can actually do that, and that it doesn't need to be retrained. You can just seed it with a new task, kind of like you would give a human participant in an experiment. You can tell them, look, this is what you should do. Now carry forward, right? So in that way, I think that's actually an important step forward. But still, the types of tasks that people are looking at are too much like the tasks that have been studied for a long time in terms of sentiment analysis and natural language inference and judging grammaticality and so on, where I'd like to see more tests on some of the desiderata that I was talking about, like conceptual combination and relying on world knowledge and interfacing with other key functions of language processing that people readily do.
Thanks. So just one last question before I turn to the audience questions. So something I mentioned initially, and that was in the description of the event, is what are the implications of all the limitations of these language models that you have raised during these presentations for the use of these models that are now being made in various areas of commercial ventures, among others. So the fact that these models have no intrinsic concern for truth or falsity, the fact that they don't have goals, that they're not grounded in perception, that they're not amenable to belief revision. Is all of this something we should be concerned about in applications of these models? Should they come with disclaimers? So do you have thoughts on these practical implications?
It depends on what you want to do, right? It depends on what your goals are. Like, my goal is to try to understand how language works. So for my purposes, these models, I think, will take us a long way to getting, insights into some mechanistic level understanding how that happens. It's not going to get me to how people use information extracted from language to reason, because those models don't do that, and neither does a language system, right? So, but if you want to, if you're trying to build a complete model of the human brain where you want to have like a vision component, a motor interactive component, a language, statistical component, and some symbolic thought representations, well, then, your benchmark should target some combination of them and their interaction. But I think like a lot of these choices are just going to be driven by what it is that you're trying to do, and different people have different goals, as very clear from even just this discussion.
So just to clarify, I was thinking more of commercial applications like chatbots and these kind of applications where users might not really know much about how this model works and what they actually do, and might jump to conclusions. Melanie, you had.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of dangers that we have to be aware of, and this has been around since the 60s with chatbots like Eliza, where people kind of over attributed sort of agency and intentionality to these very simple chatbots. People are just that's the way people are. They anthropomorphize, they attribute more intelligence to these things than they have. So I think people are going to do that with these language models, and there's already been a lot of examples of problems like GPT-3, spreading kind of these fake or untrue claims, and also the kinds of biases it has. If you prompt it with something like, something about Muslims, it will start talking about terrorism and other kinds of examples like that. So there's definitely a lot of issues, and there's been a lot of work on trying to figure out how do you mitigate those issues. OpenAI they claimed they weren't releasing GPT-2 because it was too dangerous for all these reasons. Then they commercialized GPT-3, which is even more powerful. So I think it's a big problem.
Yeah, I agree with everything said in that respect, that I think applications in terms of actual having an AI assistant that you can converse with that really genuinely understands what you're saying and genuinely understands what it is saying, that's a long way off. And I'm concerned by the issues that you raised, Raphaël, that it doesn't have consistent beliefs, the system, it doesn't have a goal or a thought in mind that it's trying to express before it's trying to produce the language that it's trying to say. It might use the word suitcase, but it doesn't know what a suitcase is a thing in the world. It doesn't even know that there are things in the world like that have names, or that there are different types of concepts if it's trained purely on text. So all these things, perhaps that could warrant a disclaimer, perhaps not. If you're aiming for something completely general purpose, I think that's going to be a long way away. But in terms of the approach, which we touched on, where you take one of these systems trained on a tremendous amount of text, and then all you care about is sentiment analysis, and you just fine tune it to do that one task on a whole bunch of data. That works very well, and I think that will get us far. And it may not make as much of a difference whether it really approaches anything like the human-like meaning of the word when it uses it. But then I'm especially concerned by the concern that Melanie raised about bias, because these large-scale models do have a lot of biases. They're trained on a lot of data that's biased. And in this fine-tuning approach where you start with BERT, and then you fine-tune it to do task A and task B and task C, if BERT's biased, then all those other tasks are going to be biased too, because it's trained on top of those bias parameters. So I think that especially emphasizes why it's crucial to have better approaches for mitigating those issues.
Thanks. So let's turn to audience questions. So there's a first question that I saw in different forms several times in the Q&A session. So here's the first version of the question: how many parameters and what amount of data is used by the brain to do what we want to do with computers? And the person who asked this question added, I bet it's less than GPT-3. There's another question along similar lines about how energy efficient and data efficient the brain is, and specifically I suppose the language network part of the brain. So this relates to questions about the poverty of stimulus arguments. So do you want to address this question about how the brain, the human brain and language models compare in respect to their efficiency?
Well, it's a little bit tricky because we still have a relatively poor understanding of how the circuits in the human brain perform whatever it is that they perform. And so, you can try to make some estimates based on, numbers of cells. But as Mark Harnett, for example, in BCS at MIT discovered, human neurons, unlike many other animals, neurons have especially rich dendritic trees. So there may be a lot of local computations that's possible. So then it just becomes, tricky to think about how to compare these models. Now, developing artificial neural network models with more internal unit complexity is one direction that I know a few groups are pursuing that may bring us to a more comparable state where we can at least try to draw some parallels. But it's not to be underestimated. I think it's underestimated in thinking about language evolution, where people often have this bias to think that some particular computation evolved in the human brain that was not possible before, as opposed to just say, well, the space expanded and suddenly we could store orders of magnitude more communicative signals, and maybe out of that complexity somehow, generativity emerged. But anyway, I don't know if it's worth speculating more, because I just think they're not quite comparable yet because of the issue that I mentioned.
In terms of data efficiency, I think that's critical as well, that children are going to hear on the order of a few million words a year, and it's not the billion scale that GPT-3 is being trained on, and that suggests that they might be doing something different in terms of architecture, in terms of objective function, in terms of connecting the language to the rest of the world. And those differences are going to be important. I think the way these models are trained, say in BERT, that's trying to predict a missing word in context, is not a good objective function for learning language as a child. In that, if say when BERT gets a new word that isn't trained before, and it makes a prediction and gets it wrong, and it's told, oh, it's this new word, like it's xylophone or aardvark. That doesn't make much of an impact. It doesn't really make a lot of updates for just a single presentation of a new word. And in some of our other work, we've shown that when you introduce a new word like this, these models don't really like to use them until they've mixed in with lots of other words, and it gets a lot of the correlational structure, where with a child, they get introduced to an aardvark, and that's really interesting. They're this is a new concept. What does it mean? How can I use this word? How can I understand this word? So I think they're evaluated. They're trying to generalize as quickly as possible. They're not just saying, oh, I predict this word wrong, and then you move on. And I think that's that's very important and might be part of the issue, the differences and the massive differences in efficiency.
Yeah, I think just to add on briefly to that, when these models are fine-tuned, as Brenden talked about, for a specific task, they still, even if they've been pre-trained on billions of words, they still need tens of thousands of examples of the new task, which clearly, you know, a child who's doing sentiment analysis doesn't need that kind of training. So it's just a really different kind of thing.
Thanks. So there's another general question that comes up a lot. It's the million-dollar question, really, which is how do we understand understanding in the context of this discussion? And it particularly, several people point out that how do we know from an algorithm achieving perfect accuracy on our best benchmarks that it's achieving perfect accuracy for the right reasons? So that relates again to this distinction between performance and competence, and to some extent we've already belabored that question, but I don't know whether you have anything to add on that, how we should operationalize understanding.
Well, as I quoted Minsky in my last slide, you know, it's not a scientific concept. Understanding, it's a pre-scientific concept. It's something it's a placeholder for something we don't understand, right? Just like all the other things about the mind that we talk about, like consciousness and so on. So it's hard to say exactly how we would recognize. I think that's kind of the key thing that we're learning when we do these experiments and we do these probes, that it's hard to pinpoint. And you know, the Turing test was a proposal that it was all about just behavior. Just you know, look at the behavior of the system. You don't have to look and see what mechanisms it's using. Whereas, you know, other people have proposed that we actually, you know, we have to go, that understanding requires a simulatable model of the world, and we have to go into the system's guts and find it. And if it's not there, it's not understanding. So I don't think there's agreement, and it's just not an answerable question right now.
Thank you. And we're running out of time, but perhaps just very quickly, a final question that also comes up several times in the Q&A. Is the way forward to more general purpose algorithms to just expand the actual existing architectures, neural networks, for example, with multimodal capabilities, or connecting them to action, and having perhaps differentiable modules in the neural network, or should we bite the bullet and have some hybrid architectures with some more symbolic elements added?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we can all speculate what the most promising way forward is. And in terms of the desiderata that I put forward with Greg Murphy, I do think that it's not that the system itself needs to be an incredibly accurate caption generation vision algorithm and can produce actions and all that, but want to make sure that the semantic representations are sufficiently rich, have the right types of properties and internal structure, that if you were to hook up the camera, you were to hook up the robotic legs, that those representations can interface with those basic functions of language in terms of describing something or being able to perform actions in the world. Or it should have something identifiable as a coherent beliefs that it would stand by and not change its mind if you just change the punctuation and the sentence. That this related also to the previous questions in terms of understanding. I think that if a GPT-3 spits out a news article, but you know it's never actually seen any of the visual objects that are in the article, it doesn't have beliefs, it doesn't do all these things, then we don't need to give it the benefit of the doubt that it really knows what it's talking about. But if those demonstrations are in place, then I think perhaps we should. But I think ultimately some of those abilities you might be able to hook up different neural modules together, and something like that could work. But in terms of composition or beliefs, some of those things are very well suited for classic symbolic approaches as well, like knowledge bases, and that could be a way of augmenting these systems, with the types of capabilities that we're talking about that would look very different. So I think it's unclear, and it'll be exciting to see what comes in the next few years.
Okay, well, perhaps we should wrap up now. So thank you again to all three of our speakers for wonderful presentations. Pamela?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I learned so much, and there were so many interesting questions in the chat, a really engaged audience. So that really speaks to how these were just fantastic talks. Really, really on the cutting edge and, really informative. So thank you so much to you, Raphaël, for organizing this stimulating event, and for all of the speakers, And thanks also to our audience who asked such good questions.